Hi, I'm Gerst, founder of the Educational Liberty Alliance. We are dedicated to helping people organize and push for diversity of thought in K through 12 schools. Along the lines of Eric's comments from the first panel, we're going to try to model a discussion with opposing viewpoints, which hopefully will provide insight into the issue that we are discussing. Our topic, as Ilana said, is whether teachers should advocate for social justice in the K through 12 classroom. Traditionalists instinctively say no, while those of a more progressive bent are often in favor of it. I'll introduce today's panel only briefly because of our limited time, but their impressive credentials are found on the conference website. First, we have Garry Mitchell. He's a doctoral student at Harvard Graduate School of Education and a Stone PhD scholar in inequality and wealth concentration through the Kennedy School. He previously worked as a middle school English and history teacher in New York City. Garry considers his research commitment to educational justice inextricably linked to his identity as an African-American male descended from enslaved peoples in the United States, alongside his professional identity as a teacher and pedagogue. Tony Kinnett, our second panelist, is the founder of the Chalkboard Review Education Journal. He has a master's in curriculum development and education technology from Ball State University and is taught in schools from inner city Milwaukee and Indianapolis to rural Wisconsin and Indiana. He is currently the science coordinator for the Indianapolis Public Schools system. So let's get started, gentlemen. First, we need to define social justice advocacy. A fair start seems to be that social justice advocacy refers to calls for changes to institutional policies or laws to achieve something. But what is that something? Garry, I'd like to start with you. What are some examples of social justice causes you've seen advocated for in the classroom? And how would you characterize what that something is that social justice is trying to achieve?
Yeah, thanks so much, Graham. I'm excited to be here. So I'll use an example from my own classroom. When I taught fifth grade in New York, I just so happened to be teaching at an all-girls school at in this particular example. But one of the things that we did was we had a whole unit on migration. And so, we studied some of the more traditional forms of migration of peoples that we think about, migrating from, one country to another. But we also focused on forms of migration that were maybe more familiar and more current to some of my students living in Brooklyn. And so one of the things that we talked about was gentrification. And through focusing on gentrification, we were able to focus more broadly and explore more broadly other forms of displacement. And so one social justice issue that we were able to grapple with then was the social justice issue of forced displacement. And I think that the goal of focusing on that and discussing that with my students as it relates to social justice is making sure that students understand aspects and elements of fairness, aspects and elements of inclusion and belonging. And there's a lot of other sort of tentacles that has, but to be succinct, that's what I'd say as an example from my classroom.
And just quickly to follow up, when you say forced displacement, what are you referring to? And what is kind of the commonality that you think different social justice causes have?
Yeah, so forced displacement were instances of people being moved from their homes, areas, or regions, or being coerced out of their homes, areas, or regions for any number of reasons. It might be economic factors, it might be due to violence in the area, and so those were some of the issues that we grappled with in that unit. And then talking about social justice, could you repeat that second part of the question?
Yeah, just what's kind of the common characteristic? What is the, as I originally framed it, what is that something? We talk about social justice being advocating for changes to laws and policies, but what's the ultimate goal?
In my view, I think the ultimate goal of advocating for social justice is to create a society in which we are not only bringing people in from the margins, but we're also expanding the center and making a society that is more representative, reflective, and inclusive of of all people, but especially for those who have traditionally been on the margins.
Tony, let's get your perspective of what are some examples that you've seen in the classroom or read about, and how would you characterize the something that these social justice causes are trying to achieve generally?
So in order to kind of take a look at social justice causes over the last couple of years in classrooms, I really like to take kind of an open framework of the specific instances of things that have been reported on that teachers often discuss in professional developments, things that students usually tend to remember, of things that were maybe outside of the content knowledge or academic standards that have been really hit home on by the educator. Kind of when the teacher says, stop, let's take a look at these different issues and the combinations of them. So in the last 5 to 10 years, these have come under certain kinds of frameworks, like the importance of incorporating slavery reparations, free public housing, racial and gender quotas, as Garry stated, gentrification and collective financial issues, calling for the abolition of Western civilization principles under the guise of decentralizing whiteness, promoting Black Lives Matter protests and riots, adhering to the 1619 Project, hypersexualized education in elementary classrooms, and issues suggesting that national and global problems lay at the feet of a specific racial and sexual group. And the reason that I would characterize all of those as social justice issues is because this something to achieve in social justice is all built around closing perceived gaps in outcomes that have to be caused by harmful actions of another group, often with little statistical data proof other than that the gap exists, therefore there must be some type of malicious intent and action. That's why it's social justice and not advocating specifically for justice. Advocating for justice means every individual is treated equally and fairly under the law, whereas social justice says that's not getting the job done. And so therefore we have to advocate for other means in order to solve those societal issues that we see present via historical or present collective gaps.
So you've both come up with with kind of definitions of what you think that something is that is the commonality for social justice. But there are two different conceptions, and I don't know that we sort of have a societal consensus around it. Equally, it seems that both of the definitions you came up with are fairly broad and could encompass a lot of things, which would seem to give, if we give teachers and administrators license to advocate for social justice, it would seem to give them the ability to select which causes they deem appropriate. Is that discretion concerning, or do we trust our educators to make those decisions about which causes to advocate? Tony, why don't you go first on this one?
I think that's really the key issue here is it really matters the size. Excuse me, my cat's being very excited about the piano. I think that the key issue here to consider is that really who's swinging the bat of deciding what issues to discuss is incredibly important to discuss. I don't really want someone with my complete opposite political views telling my child how they should think or feel about certain issues. And vice versa, someone who has completely opposite political views from me probably doesn't want me giving all of my students my unique perspective on history and all of the opinions that come with it. And that's really key to this conversation. And that's something that we need to keep in mind, is that anytime we give someone power to do something, once the power changes hands to someone who I may disagree with, that becomes a key issue.
Garry, following up, we obviously give teachers a lot of leeway over how to present things in the classroom, for example. Do we trust our educators for these sorts of decisions about what's appropriate, or are we concerned, or are you concerned about that type of discretion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends on what it is that we're talking about educators doing. If we're talking about educators presenting students with issues and encouraging them to become more knowledgeable around the issues, I think that that's one thing. Sorry, my lights went off in the background. I think the other thing, though, is if we're talking about having a sort of indoctrination of sorts around a particular issue and an outcome from that issue, I think that would lead me to answer differently. I think what's really important in the way that I see it is that there are groups of people, many of whom, I mean, all of whom, because schools are one of the only compulsory institutions that we have in our society, we see our students represent everyone, right? And because of that, it's important for us to make sure that in the classroom, we are recognizing all of our students' humanity. And part of that involves, I think, condemning certain things and making sure that certain things are not on the table. That doesn't mean that you're telling students exactly how to act or how to respond to those things not being on the table, or to those sort of what I think might be universally condemnable actions or ways of thinking and being. But I do think what is important is that we're allowing students to sort of form and develop specific actions and outcomes on their own, with some guidance perhaps. But I don't think what I'm interested in arguing is that teachers should necessarily or always be leading students all the way from point A to point Z in terms of, social justice causes and specific actions.
That's helpful. Let's shift a little bit. I think it would be helpful in the discussion to understand what we think K through 12 education should be trying to foster and develop in students. Garry, why don't you start us off on this one?
Yeah, so I tend to believe quite strongly in the civic purposes of education. Education, in my mind, should be about creating a better society and preparing individuals to make society better. And I think part of that is them helping students become their best selves as well. And so I think a lot of what I view as social justice in the classroom sort of revolves around my stipulation that good educators and good education helps prepare students to repair the world and bring it closer to what ideally we would like for it to be, sort of, in a normative sense.
And when you say better prepare students to repair the world, I think is the phrase you used. What do you mean by that, and how do you prepare the students to do that?
Yeah, I think, Tony identified and talked about some gaps that we see in society and in the world. I think that a lot of those gaps, the gap is sort of the manifestation of an underlying issue. And one of the things that I see as important is having students prepared to address those root causes. Well, first being able to identify what those root causes are, and then being prepared to remediate them and address them.
Tony, what's your response? What are the things that you think a K through 12 education should be seeking to foster, and in terms of what Garry's saying about sort of trying to getting students to address root causes? How does that play into that?
Yeah, so I would believe that through most of my research, and obviously my growth as a teacher, I'm much different than the first time that I set foot in a classroom. At the present time, I believe the highest goal of American K-12 education should be to prepare its students to be the most successful at wielding the three fundamental rights that we all have: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To wield these properly, we have to have a firm grasp on the functional, vocational skills to work in our economy. We need an academic and accurate understanding of our history, a solid framework of what makes a man or woman, his and her rights, and then the philosophy behind those. And then, of course, an appreciation of the virtues that govern a functional society, which often comes through the beauty of, let's say, the arts. So a substantive knowledge without virtue, vocational training, and philosophy creates a hopeless nihilist doom to seek authoritative Machiavellianism as a savior. And skills without values could leave a person absent of purpose. So it matters little what my students could make in a future economy if they don't really want to have anything to do with it. Entertainment, pleasure, and gluttony don't fulfill someone indefinitely. Teaching students a series of values without a comprehensive tool belt of skills and virtue cripples the student post-graduation. So we see this really with a lot of Chicago and LA graduates right now who statistically really don't have an ability to read past a second grade level, but could tell you many aspects of social emotional learning. So how are they supposed to keep a job and rear a family? And this really correlates to what Garry is saying as far as repairing the world. I would question the authority of really anyone in education to define certain issues that need to be brought to the table. and really in recognizing historical gaps and what the solutions are to those gaps. As a teacher, it's very easy for me to select which information I want my students to see regarding repairing certain historical situations or gaps in general. Therefore, it's really incredibly important that when I'm talking about the value of education, that it's done through the objective lens that, as Garry said, students have to become better people and they have to go out and they have to make the society a better place. I think that it's perhaps just a little more centered on kind of the classical Western civilization ideas and values of individualism.
So yeah, so one of the things you bring up that the school should inculcate are values of some kind. And if that's the case, how do we determine, particularly in our current society where different people, I think, probably have different value systems, how do we determine which values the school should be using in the school system? Who should be making that determination? This is just to follow up to Tony, to what you were saying earlier.
So this is really the tough one, right? So how the state is in charge of public education, which means that I, as a taxpayer, am responsible for giving a certain amount of knowledge to the kids in my community, which means that I'm responsible for what values are being taught to those kids. Therefore, I really would suggest kind of a minimalist approach to how the state is teaching values, encouraging things like family and the home, make sure that we're keeping our parents really at the top as far as teaching values to our students. Now, of course, that's not going to completely cut it. Education doesn't come without virtue. It doesn't come without an understanding of beauty and value. I would suggest that there are some values that are objectively better than others. And within that, within the last 10 years or so, we've seen quite a divergence in education in K through 12. We've seen a suggestion that one of the best ways to go about life is with an extreme adherence to the collective, to the group, and that all of your virtues and all of your sins come from that identity. And I disagree. I think that's objectively a worse way to go about teaching a student rather than focusing on individualism, which Western civilization was built upon and thrived through.
So Garry, let's get your thoughts on this. And so we're talking about the schools, K through 12 schools fostering values. I think Tony set forth a set of values that he thinks, albeit a kind of a minimalist set of them, but a set of values that he thinks the school should be inculcating in the students. What are your thoughts on this issue? What should schools be using and fostering values in students, and if so, which ones?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that schools should be fostering values in students. I think where I diverge from Tony's perspective is that I think I'm kind of on the other end of things. I think while there's an importance in focusing on individualism as well, I think that the collective should be the priority. And I think that part of that is from my personal lens, and also from the lens of being a teacher who worked in schools where many of my students aren't sort of afforded the lens of individualism, because that's not necessarily how society views them. And I also think sort of like, regardless of how society might view me or my students, I think that there's a lot of beauty in collectivism and prioritizing that as one of the values. I also think, we hear the terms equality and equity kind of brought into conversations a lot. I think that equity the way that I think of equity is not necessarily giving everyone the same thing, but giving different demographics what it is that they need to fulfill their purpose, or maybe a broader collective purpose. And I think that that is one of the values that in a lot of my work I propone and promote, and then that's one of the values that I try to work through with my students a lot when I was in the classroom as well.
So it sounds like the two of you, and this is granted a somewhat superficial discussion with limited time, but I think just sort of hearing it in this brief venue, in this brief opportunity, it almost sounds like the two of you are in a lot of ways diametrically opposed on what the value should be taught. I mean, on the one hand, you got Tony who's pushing for a very individualistic priority, and you, Garry, are talking about more of a collective. I suspect that if we had more time and you were looking at this like a Venn diagram, the two circles would have some overlap, but also have a lot of portions that are on either side. If this is going to end up being contentious on kind of both ends that are excluded from each other's circles, how do we get some sort of consensus on what values the school should be teaching? This is like to you, Garry, back to you.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think some people would, and Tony might feel this way, I'm not sure, but I think some people would say that, you know, we're not going to find consensus, and so the way to sort of approach that and navigate that is by teaching things that are uncontroversial, and maybe assuming a sort of neutrality, reading, writing, arithmetic, being some of the examples of things that are neutral. I personally don't necessarily feel that way. I think that even things that are now taken as sort of fundamental fact, fundamental knowledge, and viewed as neutral are still incredibly laden with values. They've been constructed in a way throughout history that have sort of brought certain groups to the fore, certain individuals to the fore, even to the exclusion of others. And so I think that without agreeing on sort of a movement towards collectivism, towards inclusion, I think then we maintain the status quo. And if we sort of agree as, you know, educators that where it is that we've been for the last several hundred years is a place that we're excited about or think has been in the best interest of our children, then I think that, you know, we should probably continue doing things the way that they've been done. If, however, we're interested in building a society that does not sort of place certain students on pedestals at the exclusion of others, I think we might need to rethink some things.
Tony, what's your reaction? How do we decide which are the values we're going to use in the schools?
Well, Garry, you had me until like the last 10%. I'm absolutely in agreement that if people who are more individualistic and people who are more based toward the collective are going to work together in a public school system, then it needs to be done from an unbiased as possible lens in a very neutral fashion. I think that's a good compromise. That's certainly not how I would like to personally go about seeing things. And you also indicated that's certainly not how you'd like to personally go about seeing things, but that is a good compromise. I would very much so disagree that kind of approaching things from a neutral perspective is the status quo. American education has not followed that perspective in the last 100 years. In a lot of ways, especially when you take a look at civics education. Of course, the civil rights movement fought very hard to make sure that there were certain individualistic values that every person had regardless of color. And that is a fundamental good that we teach in our classroom. That's not necessarily neutral. And that is very individualistic. Of course, there are going to be some differences regarding, you know, teaching civil rights to our students. The perspectives of Dr. King and Malcolm X are very, very different. One based towards individualism and one based toward the collective. But I would suggest that it's not a status quo kind of idea to treat your classroom in a neutral sense. For example, in my science classroom, I made a very concerted effort to keep my opinion out of the material. This happens a lot during environmental science. You start discussing the different types of energy and politics hops in really quick. I tried to keep my personal feelings and whether one would suit collectivism or individualism really out of the process so that my students could learn those effectively. And that's very unlike how many public education classrooms are like today. They have been opinionated. Being opinionated in classrooms is the status quo.
Let me ask this. I mean, we're talking about values in the schools, and we also want to encourage independent thought. Is there any potential conflict there? I mean, are we encouraging students to make their own decisions about what values they want to incorporate into their own lives? Garry, why don't you go first with this one?
I think that, you know, in an ideal world, we might be leading students towards a buffet of values, and not necessarily, what I do think is that it's not best for children for us to tell them which values are the ones that they should sort of hold above all others. But I do think that we should point them towards this buffet of values and encourage them to hold some very near and dear to themselves. I think we can show them through the selection of materials and resources what sort of placing some values over others, how that's resulted for certain people throughout history. But I think that to tell them that this value is what they must, is the one that they must hold dear, might be a little outside of our purview in an instructional space. And I know we haven't necessarily gotten into schools as more than instructional spaces, but I might answer that question a little bit differently if we're talking about, a setting within a school that, falls outside of, classroom instructional time.
Mm-hmm. Tony, any thoughts?
I'm more than happy with presenting students with a very fact-based view of history and then letting them derive the values that they see from it. I have no problem with showing my students, the horrors of Nazi Germany and what that ideology did, and also the horrors of communism and what that ideology did, and the millions that both ideologies left dead. I don't have a problem with showing my students kind of the focus of, at length collectivism and showing how it ruined France for more than 100 years. And showing them that through individualism, that through history, certain things came to pass. I would caution the idea of just giving students kind of a smorgasbord of values and then saying, go pick one. They're kids, and kids have pretty poor judgment. I really enjoy getting to work with a lot of kids who want candy all the time. And I'm sure that we could give students candy for dinner and say that certain value systems, you pick which one you want. Obviously, the kid's going to go eat the candy. That doesn't necessarily mean it's best for them. I do think there are some value systems that are objectively better than others. And by objectively, I mean that can fit into instructional time. Objective values that at the end of the day do not encroach on the rights of a person. As soon as something encroaches on a right, it becomes a negative impact on any value system. So I think that it does play a little into instruction time.
Now,
hey, Graham, just really quickly. I agree with what you said there, Tony, and I just want to make sure that it's clear that I wasn't part of what I was saying was that it is important for us to sort of lay out for students the benefits or maybe drawbacks of different value systems.
Sure.
As evidenced by different events in history. And I think that we're in agreement there. I think the one thing that I would say is that it's also important for us to, I guess I'd like to hear more a little bit about what you said about helping students understand that there are some value systems that are objectively better, because I actually really agreed with that. And I'm wondering, it feels maybe slightly contradictory to some of the other things that you voiced earlier.
Yeah, Tony,
we good? Yeah, absolutely. So when I suggest that we should be teaching that some value systems are objectively better, I am talking about the fundamentals that built Western civilization. I am suggesting that the Western civilization that focused primarily on the foundations of justice, pure and simple with no additives, that's really what I'm focusing on, and finding that through the beauty of the arts. You're never going to get education to a space where it can be completely unbiased. It can't happen. There is no law that we can pass. There are no amount of cameras in classrooms that are going to keep every teacher so obsessively neutral that they're not going to get any moral value system from that class. And while I can show a series of good things and bad things and give students the opportunity to pick, at the end of the day, some of my moral virtue and value is going to shine through in the classroom. And so while I think that aiming towards neutrality is a good thing, and I think that is where I would like to make that compromise towards and really head in that direction, I am making the case that it's not always going to be that way. And so if I have to pick between a situation of where the person is going to tell their students that certain things are objectively good and objectively not good, then I want to make sure that the teacher in that situation is laying those out in a neutral fashion.
Let me take a shift a little bit back from values generally to social justice. So, when we get started, we talk about how social justice is calling for changes to laws and institutions that have developed through the democratic process. Often those laws do need to be changed because they're flawed for a variety of reasons. I mean, outlawing legalized discrimination during the civil rights era is a terrific example of that. Is enlisting students, and Garry, maybe this gets to your comment earlier about repairing the world, so I'll start with you. Is enlisting students an appropriate way to get those changes made?
I think it depends on what you mean by enlisting. I think bringing students into some of those discussions is a really important step for us to take. I think that given that, all of our time is finite, but children, just by the nature of the way that the world works, we would hope that they'd have a little bit more time than us. And so the future is theirs. And so I'd like to think that it's important for us to help get students on board in terms of what it might look like to repair our society and to make it more inclusive, to make it a better society. I think that enlisting them, for a long time, we've had students writing their, local Congress people and local representatives. I think those types of activities are important. I think that what it might look like in terms of enlisting students is enlisting them to form an opinion and then to take action. I think we can sort of, I'm going back to the earlier panel where someone said, the old cliche of leading the horse to water. But, I think maybe taking off from there and letting students move in the way that they feel that they need to at that point. I do think though, however, I take a little bit less issue with involving students in maybe specific causes around social justice, because I think, Tony, you and I might disagree on the idea of neutrality. And I think that there is not necessary. I think that neutral space is a lot smaller than we tend to think it is. And so I think that by remaining silent or leaving certain things outside of the classroom space, what we're not exercising is neutrality. What we're exercising is sort of the status quo or maintenance, especially when we're talking about social justice. So I'll pause there.
So Tony, what about that? What about involving students in social justice causes as a teacher or an administrator?
Garry, I find the last thing you said really interesting, and the idea that silence and what can be kept out of classroom discussion could be considered as bias towards that event. I would caution that providing a certain emotionally charged topic to the classroom for my students to kind of be whipped up into a frenzy, as students are wont to do, is a very dangerous thing. And putting my students in an environment where I tell them that it's good for them to discuss things and get, in a lot of cases, as we've seen in a lot of these social justice advocacy cases, students are encouraged to discuss the topic, to kind of whip themselves up into a frenzy. And then you have this very strange mob-esque mentality in the classroom. So in two schools pop into my mind, one in Manhattan and one in Philadelphia, in which they were talking about a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests and kind of the things that played into the death of George Floyd. And within this classroom setting, there were students in both classrooms who dissented, who didn't agree, who didn't like where this was going. And the other students in the classroom ended up shouting these particular students down until they were forced to admit that they agreed with the majority. And I think that sometimes it is more appropriate to limit the big class-wide discussion as though these are all rational and reasonable adults who aren't going to be whipped up into a frenzy. And what I have concerns of is when we start enlisting students not to consider things, but to take action, I don't think that I should ever be in a position to tell my students to go take action. That is a very aggressive thing to request someone to do. Enlisting them in any kind of activity makes, first of all, it makes me responsible for their actions. And in a secondary nature, they're children. They're not going to make decisions based on all of the information and all of the facts ever, from a kindergartner through a student in high school. And so whether it's something on the right or something on the left, I would be very cautious about bringing some things to the classroom to an open forum discussion, only because students can, once a few loud voices start, moving along, things can get out of hand pretty quickly.
Garry, just real quick. So, I mean, you seemed open to involving students in social justice causes. You talked earlier about encouraging students to write to their respective Congress, their senators or their legislative representatives. Are you generally open to encouraging teachers encouraging students to take action? Or is there some sort of line where you sort of shift from the letter writing to something else?
Got it. So I think that letter writing is one way of taking action. I also think that I personally believe that, the old adage, actions speak louder than words, is a really important one. I think that, part of what I've experienced in my lifetime, and I kind of agree with you, Tony, these conversations are important, but they do kind of, they work students up. And I think part of what we can do is minimize the working up that happens in these conversations and encourage students to move to action. What those actions are things that we can sort of guide and we can help students with. I mean, I think if you use I think a lot of education at some point, what it pushes towards is some sort of application of that education, right? Our students might very well cut themselves while they're dissecting, in science class, but instead of saying, well, we think dissection should be off the table, at least what I've seen people do is set up certain norms, set up safety procedures so that students can engage in those activities without hurting themselves, without hurting other people. And I think similarly, we can set up certain norms, we can put parameters, and we can train our teachers to be people who can facilitate those conversations, right? And so I think the same way that not every teacher might be skilled at leading students through a dissection, not every teacher is going to be skilled at leading students through these conversations. And I think that that might be an important distinction for us to make. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to put out there. In terms of enlisting students to take action, I personally think that just because students might do something sloppily or might not do things the way that adults would do it, does not mean that we should prohibit them from doing it at all. I think that it's important for students, if they're going to be the leaders of our society and our future society, that they are allowed to sort of have messy engagements and take action in ways that might not be the cleanest. But I also think that it's important for us to guide them through that and for it to be a scaffolded process. So what I'm not advocating for is like, we're gonna go to a protest, choose a side, y'all. I'm gonna be standing back here. I'll meet you back at the classroom in an hour.
Sure.
That's not what I'm advocating for. And I don't think any good teacher would. But what I am saying is that I think that, if we're building students to be empathetic human beings, which maybe we disagree on whether or not that should be something that we should try to promote or prompt in students, but it would almost be disingenuous for them to not want to take action if we're, sort of reviewing things that have happened in history, are currently happening to them and their classmates, to just kind of intellectualize it and then leave it, and stop there. I think that might be a little bit, that might be too much for me to do as an educator. I'll just say that.
So I just want to respond in two quick things here. So first of all, I am absolutely all for encouraging empathy. We holistically agree on that. Wholeheartedly agree on that. I'm all for making sure that my students understand that based on the set of shoes you're wearing, things can be very different, and we need to understand people are coming from very different backgrounds with very different experiences. Where that ends for me is suggesting that as a collective group and a society group, because someone is coming from a place of perhaps some kind of trouble, some historical lack, just to put a word there to kind of illustrate the negative, that someone is at fault. I think there's a big difference between teaching empathy and then teaching there is empathy that requires someone else to kind of make allocations kind of against their rights. What I do want to kind of posit though, because you discussed that it's important that we kind of bring things up to our students to kind of go over things, and we have these set of norms to guide things, but you also talked about that there should be certain things that as teachers we shouldn't bring up and shouldn't be discussing. So I'm kind of finding kind of some conflict there. And because could you just help me like kind of clarify it? I'm probably lost in the weeds somewhere.
Yeah, I might have not articulated it well earlier. I think if you're referring to my earlier comment about certain things should be sort of universally or outright condemnable, that doesn't,
Sure.
I didn't take that, I did not mean by that there should be some things that we don't discuss at all. I think what I meant by that was that there are some things that in our discussions, teachers can and should condemn.
So depending on your spot on the political compass, that's going to look different. Someone's like, you know, if we're just going to go ahead and pick right out of the bucket, like the trans issue in elementary education is really big at the moment. You might have one teacher that thinks that the transgender argument in elementary is tantamount to child abuse, where someone on the other side might suggest that it's incredibly important that trans children at that age are included and represented well. And by included, I mean that those certain actions and things that they're going through are rationalized and made normal. And I just want to clarify that as a teacher, me deciding what should or shouldn't be universally condemned on that intense of a political topic could get dangerous at some point. And I like, do you kind of see kind of the danger of that, or am I off base? Kind of, I'm sorry, Graham, I don't mean to take us off of what we're discussing. I'm just curious what Gary's mind is there.
Try to respond briefly because we're entering the speed round.
Yeah, I will just say that I hear what you're saying about it being tricky territory for an individual teacher to decide what is universally condemnable. And I don't think that my suggestion that there should be some things that are universally condemnable, I did not mean in that to say that each teacher should decide for themselves what those things are.
Gotcha, thanks.
So we just have a couple minutes left. So I'm going to ask kind of a final question and ask you both to weigh in, but in kind of a relatively brief manner. So if one believes that either social justice advocacy in the classroom is improper in any way, shape, or form, or one believes that involving students in social justice causes in some sense is okay, but there are guidelines, what do we need to do in the schools administratively? What can the schools do either to prevent it altogether, given the discretion teachers have in their own classrooms, or to control it so that it's something that's acceptable? Garry, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we can do is we can move towards preparing teachers and developing teachers to facilitate these conversations in ways that don't become, you know, so that they don't become huge conflagrations, right? And I think that that's one thing that school administrators can do in order to make schools places where social justice can be brought up, and in a way that does not always mean that there are these huge shouting matches that are happening between students. The other thing that I think we can do is we can begin to sort of weave in standards that help build certain competencies in our students that would bring about social justice, even if that doesn't necessarily mean we're directly engaging in social justice outright all the time. So for instance, I believe the new name is Learning for Justice, formerly Teaching Tolerance, has a list of standards that are around, you know, inclusion, social justice, and the like. And I think that using that as an example might be one way, weaving in those standards, for example, might be one way to help bring about social justice without always talking about it, and making sure that we are still adhering to some of what others might consider those more foundational elements of education.
Tony, quickly, we're pretty much out of time, so please respond.
I would really encourage, since we're talking about advice to administrations, I would encourage administrators to kind of take a second look at how they're handling professional developments and classrooms within staff meetings. It's become a really common policy to suggest that there are voices that you want people to speak up, but then when those voices speak up, the answers that are given are very dismissive and one-off. I see this in a lot of things like racial equity trainings and things like this. And I really would encourage that if we're to bring open discussion about complicated issues such as, you know, social justice to the classroom, we first have to make sure that our teachers are modeling the same thing, which means being able to foster an environment where the teachers in your school are allowed to openly disagree with things without, suggesting that they keep quiet, which is something that we do see in a lot of public schools. There have been a lot of emails and conversations between principals and teachers, dozens that I've spoken to in the last couple of months, who were told to keep quiet when they disagreed. And I think that for the sake of ideological diversity in general, especially regarding how we're going to model this ideological diversity to our students, it's important that we make sure our teachers know that regardless of their opinion, they're not just supposed to sit in staff meetings and be quiet.
Okay. Thank you both. I think there'll be opportunities for Q&A from the audience once Ilana regains control. So Ilana, please take it from here.